to make one comment about the Kegley lectures. We will wind down the lectures for the summer, so we will not meet here at Christ Lutheran for the months of June, July, and August, but we will resume in September and follow through with October and November. And so, on that note, we're still trying to kick around some ideas for, we may put together a lecture in the summer at the Link Museum Auditorium, where it's nice and air conditioned. So just keep us in mind, more to come. At this time, we don't have anything specific. Now, here we go. So, so here's the deal. I'm very excited, and I know you will be too, to have tonight's speaker, Dr. Mills Kelly. Had I done my research on Dr. Kelly sooner, I would have brought him to Roanoke years ago, because he is also not just a writer and a hiker and a lover of history, particularly as it pertains to the Appalachian Trail. He also is the director of a project that I've been personally fascinated with for over 10 years, but it's much longer than that. He is first and foremost a professor of history at George Mason University in Fairfax, but he is also the director of the award-winning Roy Rosenweg Center for History and New Media. Now, what does that mean to me? Well, I first encountered George Mason Center for New Media when I was evaluating our own Historical Society's digital collection, which is stored online in a project called Past Perfect. But Dr. Kelly's center at George Mason is credited with developing a robust, open source content management system that's database driven called Omeka. And you may or may not know about that project, but if you've ever been to the Virginia Room's online photographic database, you've used Omeka, because they use it as the foundation of their digital presentation online. So, if you may just very well be looking at the future of online services here in Dr. Kelly for historical societies such as ours, because he's pretty much at the center of what that future can look like. Now, for Dr. Kelly is also a lifelong hiker of the Appalachian Trail, and he is also, I didn't know this, host of a very interesting podcast called The Green Tunnel, which serves up stories of history pertaining to the Appalachian Trail. I listened to one today about McAfee's Knob, so if any of you have just a remote interest in local trails and hikes and stuff, which I know all of you have been to McAfee's, you would be really interested in this podcast. Dr. Kelly is also recently the author, and that's why he's here tonight, of Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail. This is put out by the History Press in 2023. He has won numerous state, national, and international awards for his teaching and his research on teaching and learning. Most recently, the Gutenberg Teaching Award from the University of Mainz in Germany. Dr. Kelly has been a volunteer on the Appalachian Trail for many years and currently is the maintainer of the Manassas Gap Shelter in Linden, Virginia, one of the most historic shelters on the entire trail. It's probably also somewhere close to your backyard, I guess, being from that area.
About a mile and a half.
There you go. Without further ado, Dr. Mills Kelly.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everybody, for being here this evening. And there's one other part of my bio that Stephen didn't know, and that's actually that I'm from Roanoke.
Get out!
Who knew? Who knew? I was born here. My father was a faculty member at Ferrum College, and this was the closest place that my mother was a city girl. She was going to have her baby in a hospital. She was not going to have the doctor in Franklin County come by the house and deliver the baby. So they rode up here, and I was born here in the hospital here in Roanoke. We only lived in Southwest Virginia for 5 years because when I was 6, we moved to Falls Church, which is how I met one of the members of our audience. She and I had seen each other since we graduated from high school in 1977. So she's taken my place in Roanoke. So anyway, I just wanted to say, it's so great to be back and to be able to tell you this story, because it's really a very, very interesting story. And just to kind of center us all, just as a reminder, the Appalachian Trail goes from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine, spanning 14 states. This year it's 2,198.4 miles. Changes just a little bit every year. They got a couple miles longer this year than last year. The main reason the length changes is because they acquire more, better piece of land to route the trail through, or there's a rock slide, they have to route the trail around, or, just a whole variety of reasons. It changes a little bit every single year. So this year, 2,198.4. In 1937, when they declared the trail completed, it was 2,050 miles. So they've tacked on an extra almost 150 miles since then. And in those days, it actually went much further into Georgia, went all the way to Mount Oglethorpe, which is much closer to Atlanta. But they took away that 37 miles from Mount Oglethorpe to Springer Mountain for a very specific reason. How many people here have been around a chicken farm in the South in July? Not one of the more pleasant odors. And the trail came down off of Mount Oglethorpe and then went through about 15 miles of chicken farms between Jasper, Georgia and Springer Mountain. And hikers just complained to no end about the smell and the chickens running back and forth across the trail. And so they finally gave up on that and moved it to Springer Mountain, where it is now. What we're going to be talking about today is this part of the trail, the part that you all know better because it's down in this part of the state. And it's a very interesting story what happened with this part of the trail, because I mentioned the trail has been rerouted a lot over the years. The single biggest change in the history of the trail happened in 1952 when the Appalachian Trail Conference and its partners here, the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club and the Tennessee Eastman Hiking Club, decided to abandon the stretch of trail that I'm going to talk about today and move it to its current location. So just to give you an idea of what that's like, the blue line there is the current route of the trail. The red line is the route that I'm going to talk about, and that little tan line is an original proposal for that red route, and you'll notice that it swings down past Vinton rather than over McAfee Knob. And just as they were building the trail in this part of the state, the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club was forming, and its members said, okay, McAfee Knob or Vinton? Which way do we want to route the trail? So apologies if you're from Vinton, but McAfee Knob's just a lot prettier. And so that yellow line never actually happened, but that was just what the proposal was. And so the red part, you can see there's a huge difference there. At its greatest extent, there's a 52-mile space between those two routes. And also, the route that was abandoned in 1952, at the end of the hiking season in 1952, was 300 miles long. That was 15% of the entire trail at the time. So far and away, the single biggest rerouting of the trail. In fact, it's close to, if you look at all the big reroutings of the trail, 30 miles here, 15 miles there, and you add them all up, they don't come out to 300 miles. So it was really a huge change. So how did I get started working on this? Well, if you're a historian, archives are really dangerous places. And the reason they're dangerous places is because rabbit holes open up in front of you in the archives day after day. So this document was my rabbit hole. I was working on something entirely different about the history of the Appalachian Trail, and so I was going through a box of correspondence from 1929. The trail project began in 1921. Construction of the trail began in earnest in 1925, and by 1929, it was making a lot of progress. And there were two sections, though, that were unresolved. One of those was Maine, and Maine was just a mess. And in part because it was so wild in Maine, and they just had no idea where the trail was going to go. And so the first idea that they came up with for Maine was just to route it from fish camp to fish camp to fishing camp to fishing camp to fishing camp on old tote roads. And so that's kind of what the trail was in Maine in the early days. But the other part that they just couldn't resolve was southwestern Virginia. And in this letter, Myron Avery, who was about to become the chairman of the Appalachian Trail Conference, he wrote to the then chairman, a guy named Arthur Perkins, and lived up in Connecticut, and he said, southwestern Virginia is our terra incognita. And he meant that for two reasons. The first of those was that Myron Avery was from Maine. He was from Lubec, Maine, which, if you know Maine, that's as far east as you can go in the United States. Right across the river from Lubec is Canada. And so he grew up in a family working on the docks and went off to Bowdoin College and then Harvard and became a government lawyer. But he just didn't know anything about the South, really, because he was from way up East Maine, and then had lived in the Boston area and then in the Washington, D.C. area. But the other reason Southwest Virginia was terra incognita was that the most recent U.S. Geological Survey map of the area, sort of Floyd County, Carroll County, over on the other side of the New River, Washington County, that map had been done in the 1880s. So it was pretty much useless. Like, Galax was not on that map. Galax was founded in like 1903 or something like that. And so they didn't have much to work with. In fact, the best map they could find had been done by a Confederate Army engineer in 1864. And so it was, they didn't know where to go, and there were Galax was the only town of any substantial size where they could go and try to form a trail club. And so it was sort of Roanoke and then Bristol and Kingsport. There just wasn't anything in between. And the Appalachian Trail, it's important to remember, was a volunteer project. It didn't become a national park until 1968. So for the first 40 years or so of the trail's progress, it was a volunteer effort. So they needed these volunteer clubs all along the trail to figure out where it should go and then take care of it once it was there. And so I read that, and that statement about Southwest Virginia being terra incognita kind of intrigued me a little bit. And so I kept reading this letter, and he said in the letter that we just have to figure out something to do, and I kind of don't know what to do. And this is very uncharacteristic for Myron Avery. He was not lacking in self-confidence, we will say. He was not lacking in self-confidence at all. And that's something that, then the next letter, so I was kind of intrigued, because it was very unlike Myron Avery. And then this guy, in the center of the photo there, his name is Shirley Cole, and he was the first county agent for Floyd County. And he had been the county agent in Stafford County. He'd gone to Virginia Tech, but not as a matriculated student. After the turn of the century, Tech had a program for, I guess it was it was right after the First World War. They started a program for young farmers who wanted to be county agents. And it was about an 18-month curriculum that they went through, and then they went off into the extension service, which was just forming. And so Cole was one of those farmers, and so he was the first county agent in Floyd County, and he lived in Floyd, and he wrote to the Appalachian Trail Conference, and he said, I have solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. I have a route from the Peaks of Otter all the way to Damascus. And you would think if, the average person, if they were in charge of this project and they thought, it's terra incognita, oh, somebody solved my problem. That's not Myron Avery. Not a bit. Myron Avery, he was very possessive of the Appalachian Trail. He sort of felt like it was his, and in many ways. And so to have somebody who he never met, from some county he'd never heard of, in a little town named Floyd, to write and say, here's where the trail should go in southwestern Virginia, this was completely unacceptable to Myron Avery. Absolutely, totally unacceptable, because Myron Avery was the person who decided where the Appalachian Trail was going to go, not some county agent in Floyd County. So Avery kind of had a freak out about this, and he wrote to the guy in the cowboy hat, whose name was Roy Osmer. And Osmer is one of the more intriguing characters in the history of the Appalachian Trail. He was a forester in Georgia and worked for the Georgia Forest Service, and he had figured out the trail route through Georgia 2 years earlier. And what makes him especially intriguing is that later in life he became a famous hermit in Florida. He lived on a little key in St. Pete Harbor, and movie stars would go and visit him. There's a photograph of Burl Ives with Roy Osmer wearing a beret and sandals, and he lived in a shack full of books. He was just like this kook in Florida. But he hadn't become a kook when Myron Avery wrote to him in 1929. Avery wrote to him and said, Roy, I need you to come to Virginia, and I need you to come to Virginia now, because we cannot let those local people, was the way he put it, those local people decide where our trail should go. And he really meant my trail. And so that's just unacceptable. And Osmer said, I'm on my way. Apparently the Georgia Forest Service would let its employees, just take 2 months off and go scout a trail. And Osmer wrote something in that letter that it's kind of funny if you know Myron Avery. He said, and can you please send me your measuring wheel? Because Myron Avery had this measuring wheel. It was like a bicycle wheel on a piece of pipe, a little clicker on it. And almost every photograph of Myron Avery, he's holding that measuring wheel. Probably 85% of the photographs. It was like attached to his arm. And so he wrote back and he said, I'm glad you can make it, but no, you cannot have my measuring wheel. I'll arrange to have one sent to you. If you go to the Appalachian Trail Museum in Pine Grove Furnace State Park in Pennsylvania, it's kind of right around the halfway point of the trail these days, that measuring wheel is on the wall in the museum. And I think Myron Avery would be very proud to know that his wheel is there. But so Osmer goes to the Peaks of Otter, and he checks into the Hotel Mons, and if you've been up to Peaks of Otter, they have like the ruins, the foundation stones for the hotel are still there. And he checks in, spends a couple of days. Apparently the fried chicken was really good. But he finally heads off onto the trail, pushing a measuring wheel, and starts trying to measure out the trail, and immediately gets lost. If you've driven the Blue Ridge Parkway from Roanoke to, down to the North Carolina border, it runs right there along the edge of the escarpment, and you cross over an awful lot of little streams. Well, that parkway, of course, wasn't there in 1930 when Osmer started doing this. And so he had to go down into the stream beds, up out of the stream beds, down into the stream beds. Somebody actually figured out, sent me a map of Floyd, that there are 33 water gaps in Floyd County. And so Osmer just got lost. And so he did the one thing he was not supposed to do. He got somebody to give him a ride to Floyd. He looked up he looked up Shirley Cole, and he said, can you show me where you think the trail ought to go? And Cole said, I'd love to. And so they got in Cole's car and they drove along the route and got out at a whole bunch of different places and plotted out a route. And Osmer writes this report back to Washington, to Avery. It's like 11 pages, single spaced. And he says, detail, location by location by location, here's where the trail ought to go. And in the very last paragraph, he says, and Mr. Shirley Cole was very helpful in this process. Just kind of gets it to the end. And Avery, I think he realized that he was stuck. And so he then just bought in completely and said, he wrote to Perkins, and he said, we've solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. We know exactly where the trail is going to go. Roy Osmer was especially helpful, he never mentioned Shirley Cole, and to finding this route. Now, the route of the Appalachian Trail on the east side of the New River looked mostly like that. Old roads, and I took that photograph down near Fancy Gap a couple of years ago, and you notice the fog, because if you spend any time down there, it's pretty foggy. In fact, the name of Fancy Gap before it was Fancy Gap was Foggy Camp, and in recognition of just how foggy it is in that part of the county. But they just used old roads. Now, the road that they mostly used followed along when you were going down along the Floyd-Franklin line, they used the route that the Blue Ridge Parkway takes today, because there's a roadbed there that goes back into the colonial period, and before that was a Cherokee path, and so it's a very ancient route. And during the colonial era, that road was known as the Carolina Road or the Philadelphia Road, depending on which direction you were going. And by the 1920s and 1930s, it was just known as the Ridge Road, for obvious reasons. It runs right there on the edge of the ridge. But it had fallen into disuse, and so it was available for hikers. And so that became, along the escarpment there, that became the route until you got to Patrick County, and then it dropped down into the Dan River Gorge. But when the planners for the Blue Ridge Parkway came along, they said, oh, look, a roadbed, we'll use that. And so then told the Appalachian Trail Conference, yeah, sorry about your trail, it just needs to move, because we're building a road. They said that to everybody, like, sorry about your property, we're building a road. And so So the Blue Ridge Parkway forced the trail to move into a whole variety of sort of conniptions around the edge there. And the only way to really hike that old section today is to get a hold of one of the trail guides. The Floyd Public Library has a full set from the period of the 1930s to the 1950s. And you can just sort of follow step-by-step instructions to determine where the trail went in a particular year, because it did move around a fair bit on old roads. But there are sections that you can hike today pretty easily. So if you're on the Parkway in Floyd, and you're in the Rocky Knob area, just south of the Rocky Knob, just south or just north, I forget, close to the Rocky Knob camping area, one of the overlooks is the Saddle. And it's just, you know, beautiful view out over the Piedmont. And if you pull into that spot, as I did yesterday, I guess, and look out, get your view, you look out, and then you look to your right at the edge of the parking lot, there's a little trail that goes up into the trees. That's the old Appalachian Trail. That's the old Appalachian Trail. There's no marker. Park Service has no historic markers or anything like that. And if you look to the left, it goes up into the trees the other way, that's the old Appalachian Trail. They now call it the Rock Castle Gorge Loop, but up there on top, it is the old Appalachian Trail. In the Smart View Park, there's a section there. If you think about where that old settler cabin is in Smart View, that's the old Appalachian Trail there. And the trail guides were great because they gave you lots of detailed instructions. Like, when you reach the County Line Primitive Baptist Church, turn left. County Line Primitive Baptist Church. Or the Elliston Store, turn right. Elliston Store, I took that picture a couple of years ago. It needs a little love at this point. So the trail, you know, those old trail guides are great because they also had things like, cross the softball field. If a game is in session, go around. You know, things like that. But so one of the most spectacular parts of the trail in Southwest Virginia was the Pinnacles of Dan. Does anybody hike the Pinnacles? Yeah. And it's a challenge. It's a challenging. You can go still. You have to get a permit from the power company to go. But and I'm always puzzled on why it's plural, because they call it the Pinnacles, plural, of Dan. But there's only one. You're looking at the one pinnacle. But it's kind of pyramid-shaped mountain that's just like dropped down into the Dan River Gorge there. And the trail on one side is pretty good, and the trail on the other side was really bad. I talked to a man named Gene Espy, who hiked the trail in 1951. He was the second person to thru-hike the whole trail. I interviewed him in 2019. Gene was 91 at the time. And I said, Gene, what was it like hiking over the Pinnacles of Dan? He said, well, you know, it wasn't so bad on one side, but on the other side, I think I fell the whole way. It's kind of, sort of like if you remember the kids' movie Toy Story, you know, Buzz Lightyear had falling with style. That's kind of how you got down the Pinnacles. But, you know, down in the gorge, there are, you know, beautiful waterfalls down there, and some of them filled in by the lakes now, but this is the Little Falls of Dan instead of the larger one. And those two photos I just showed were actually from Myron Avery's personal scrapbook. So the trail, you know, kind of cruised along there, and the question was, where would you spend the night? Well, when you're at the Saddle, if you take that trail just to your right, and you go up the hill a little bit, you get to this trail shelter, and it's the only trail shelter that was built on the old section of the trail in Southwest Virginia. It was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the building of the Blue Ridge Parkway, and the reason it's still there, this is a picture from just 2 years ago, the reason it's still there is because if you know anything about the Civilian Conservation Corps, you know that they liked concrete. Concrete and stone. But I'll also tell you that this trail shelter, as a trail shelter maintainer myself, this trail shelter would not be allowed today. Has anybody been to this one? So you know, you go out the front door, and the first step, awesome. Second step, awesome. Third step, 1,000 feet straight down. and so, I mean, the National Park Service would have an absolute freak out if this was in heavy use by campers, because, you know, you wake up in the middle of the night, you get up for a minute, go out in the bushes and forget where you are, and then you're down in Lower Patrick County all of a sudden. And so, so if you go, and it's really foggy, don't go out the front door of the shelter. But the view is spectacular. If you stand there and you look, you can actually see there's off of Belcher Road, you can see a little pond there, and that's the source of the Dam River. That is the source of the Dam River right there. So it's a really pretty spot. But mostly people stayed in other people's homes. People who took in boarders along the trail. And this was common all along the Appalachian Trail in those days. This is Ma Sue Hall, who was the main midwife in Floyd County. And she was one of the people who took in hikers. And she would feed them dinner, they could have a shower, she'd feed them breakfast, and send them on their way. And she charged for that $1.50. And her phone number was in the trail guide, one of the old 5-digit phone numbers. And so, you could stay with Cletus Reed and his wife in Copper Hill. Or my favorite is you could stay with a woman named Erna Webb. Anybody recognize that house? Yeah, it's the Sidna Allen house outside of Fancy Gap. And if you know anything about the history of Carroll County, you know about the courthouse shooting. And Sidna Allen was one of the shooters, and when he went to prison, he couldn't pay his legal bills, and he had just finished this huge house, which this photo is about 6 years old. They're actually renovating it now, so it's going to be a house museum, and it's going to be real nice. But his lawyer ended up with the house, and then the lawyer then sold the house to the Webb family. One of the people who died in the courthouse shooting was Sheriff Webb, and so his brother, I think, that ended up with the house. But then Mr. Webb and their child had passed by the time the trail came along, but Mrs. Webb was still there, and she took in hikers. And so just think about that for a minute. If you're hiking along the Appalachian Trail and you've got your guidebook and it says Erna Webb will take you in, give you dinner and a shower and breakfast for, I don't know what she charged, probably about $1.50. And so you take her up on that, and you'd go stay in this big, huge house. And at the dinner table, what are the odds that she didn't tell you the story of the courthouse shooting? And how they had to send the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency guys on a special train, with their horses and Winchester rifles to reestablish law and order in Hillsville. It was just this crazy story. And so, of course, she would have told hikers that story, and they would have thought, okay, I have something to tell people when I get home. It's better than talking about copperheads on the trail, Or if you're in Galax, you could stay at the Bluemont Hotel, sadly now burned to the ground in the 1960s, but Earl Schaefer, who was the first through hiker of the Appalachian Trail, he spent the night at the Bluemont. The trail used to go right down Main Street in Galax, which was somewhat common for the Appalachian Trail. It still does it in places, like Hanover, New Hampshire, goes where Dartmouth College is, goes right to the middle of Hanover, and Boiling Springs, North Carolina, goes right through town, lots of places, because hikers needed to eat, and they needed to spend the night. And it's important to remember that in the early days of the trail, they didn't expect people to go and hike for a month, or 3 months, or 6 months. In fact, when Earl Schaefer in 1948 announced that he had hiked the whole trail in that season, nobody believed him, because they thought that was just nuts. Why would somebody do that? And I was at Trail Days in Damascus on Friday and Saturday, and there were probably 8,000 hikers there, half of whom had hiked the whole trail in 1 year or were in the process of doing so. Something like 3,000 people are on the trail right now trying to hike the whole thing. And the early creators of the trail would just thought, that's ridiculous. That's such a dumb idea. And so they really expected people to go out for a day, or 2 days, or 3 days maybe, or maybe a week. But and so hotel accommodations were just part of the experience. So anyway, just to say a little bit more about the route, the trail from Galax, it went to the river at Freeze, crossed over, I'll tell you more about that in a minute, crossed over just a little north of Freeze, got on what's today the New River Trail, and headed up to Billsby Dam, and then at Billsby Dam, turned left and went into the mountains, went up onto Farmer Mountain. And if you're a vigorous hiker, there's still an old trail that goes up to the summit of Farmer Mountain, and the views are spectacular. I did it in 2021, and you get, it's a little grown up, but you can, you used to be able to just stand on a rock on top of the mountain and get 360-degree views. Now you have to sort of peek through the trees in various places, but you know, you see the Holston River, you see the whole New River Valley, you can see the Grayson Highlands in the distance. It's really a beautiful spot. And from Farmer Mountain, then the trail got onto what's today the Iron Mountain Trail. The Iron Mountain Trail, today's Iron Mountain Trail, is the old Appalachian Trail. And when, you know, places like Skulls Gap, this is actually from Gene Espy's personal scrapbook from 1951, but you can see the Grayson Highlands in the distance. Hikers stayed often at the fire towers, which used to be just, you know, like about every 10, 12 miles. There are only a couple of them left now, and sometimes the tower keepers would even let them stay in the tower, which was not really allowed, but they did it anyway. And then eventually you got to Damascus. This was the Damascus rail station in 1948. There isn't a Damascus rail station now. There's just a little museum there, but so that's what the trail did. And I researched all of that. And you know, learned a lot. I went out and, you know, looked at old maps and went to some of the spots along the maps. But I realized I was missing the human element of the story. And I talked to Gene Espy, who had hiked it in 1951. But Gene, he was fading a little bit mentally, and so he could remember pieces of the story, but not the whole thing. Although his wife, now think about this for just a minute. So Gene was from small town Georgia, South Georgia. And his wife's name, he and his wife went to high school together, and his wife is Eugenia. So you know that in school, somebody said, either, Gene, you have to ask Eugenia out, or Eugenia, you should go out with Gene. I mean, you know, there were probably like 50 kids in their class. So Eugenia said to me, Gene can't remember, I've heard all the stories 400 times, so I'll tell you. But I was just missing the local part of the story. So I did the thing that historians don't do a lot. I just started driving around and talking to people. And so one of those folks is a guy named Doug Bell. Doug was a lifetime warehouse manager for Lowe's, the lumberyard, regional manager. And Doug does not remember the trail or the hikers because he's too young. He's in his late 60s. But he was raised by his grandfather, who lived on a farm that the trail crossed, and his grandfather told stories of the hikers constantly. And in this photograph, Doug is standing in front of the front steps of his grandfather's home where Doug was raised. And here's a picture of that home, big white house up there. And you can just kind of see in the photograph the two buildings over there. It's the woodshed and the chicken coop. Now, Doug's grandfather, he went out, the trail actually went kind of over here in this photograph. His grandfather went out and moved the trail markers so that the hikers would come right past his front door, right between the woodshed and the chicken house. He just moved them. And he, as he explained to Doug, the reason he did that was because these hikers were from all over the place, and he spent his whole life in Floyd County, and he wanted to meet people who had lived in other places. And so they would come by, and he would say, hey, come in, you know, or do you want to buy some milk? So it was also an economic thing for him. But and so Doug was really proud of those stories about his grandfather's involvement, even though it involved, you know, moving the trail markers. But my favorite person in all of my research is Ralph Barnard. And this is Ralph and his lovely wife, Hope. And they live in Meadows of Dan. And when I started working on this, people said to me, oh, well, you know, you need to talk to Ralph Barnard. But Ralph can be a little crusty, was the way, or cantankerous was another word that I got. You know, he's a little difficult. I don't know which Ralph Barnard those folks were talking about, because the Ralph Barnard I know was anything but crusty or cantankerous or difficult. He's just a sweet man, you know, and Hope is lovely. And so I called them, and Hope answered and hung up on me because she knew I was a telemarketer. I mean, why wouldn't she hang up, right? We all get lots of those calls. And they don't have email, so I had to go old school. I wrote them a letter. And I remember my younger son was watching me write the letter. He said, what are you doing? And I said, writing a letter. He said, really? And when I printed it out, he was just fascinated. You know, look at that. You have the date on there. That's cool. You know, like it doesn't just put the date on automatically. Like you know. So and then you know, he watched me fold it and put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it. You know, he grew up in a different world. He's 24, and so I wrote them, and then Hope called me 3 days later and said, "We got your letter. We'd love to chat with you about the Appalachian Trail. You know, Ralph remembers all about it because Ralph remembered the hikers. He's old enough to remember, and his father, John, was in charge of the trail in Patrick County. And he's the one who cut the original hiking trail up to the summit of the Pinnacles back in 1908. And so Ralph was also raised by his grandfather, and so he could tell stories. I mean, he was 15 when the trail moved away in 1952, and so he also had a lot of photographs. See if you can pick out Myron Avery in the photograph. We'll note the measuring wheel. And so this is up from 1940, and this is a group of volunteers from the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club in Washington, and they come down for a week of hiking and trail work, and they stayed at the Barnard Farm. Now, I want you to just look at the house in the background for just a second. Look at the kind of arrangement of the house. Well, you can't really see it in this photograph. It's the same house. Ralph lives in that house. And although he was a brick mason, so he bricked it up in the 70s. And but it's the same house. And so it's like Ralph and I are friends now. I saw him yesterday. He's doing great. and you know, he's one of my favorite people. And in 1949, the National Geographic magazine sent a writer and a photographer along the length of the Appalachian Trail. They just kind of picking out various spots to hike and take photos. And so they came to the Pinnacles of Dan at Dan River Gorge to go to the Pinnacles of Dan, and they stayed with the Barnards. And the writer for this story describes in very lyrical terms sitting on the Barnard family front porch. A thunderstorm had just blown through. The swallows were, you know, flying around the way they do, picking up the gnats off of the grass, and that the lilac was blooming. And I read that just before I went to see Ralph the first time. And that day, a thunderstorm had blown through, and the swallows were flying around, and the lilacs were blooming, and I just got all goosebumpy. And I realized, like, I'm back in the 1940s with this National Geographic writer. This particular story is very important to the history of the Appalachian Trail because a few years later, a woman in her 60s who lived in Ohio, rural Ohio, she lived on a farm in rural Ohio, named Emma Gatewood, she read this story and she thought, I'm going to hike that Appalachian Trail. And so she told her daughter, oldest daughter, and Emma had survived an abusive husband, and I forget how many children she had, it was like 9 or something like that. And she told her oldest daughter, I'm going to go take a hike. And her daughter later said, well, you know, we were used to Mom saying stuff like that because she loved to hike. What she didn't tell her daughter was, I'm going to Maine and I'm going to hike the Appalachian Trail at 66. And so she started in Maine, and she came down off of Mount Katahdin, and then on her, like, her third day out, she dropped her glasses and stepped on them. And she couldn't see without her glasses, and she got lost. And so the rangers had to go look for her, and they finally found her, and they put her on a bus and sent her home. And the chief ranger of Baxter State Park was, I will say, not very polite about it. He actually said, go home, mother, and don't come back. And so, well, Emma Gatewood was not a woman to be told no. And so the next year, she went to Georgia and hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, known forever since as Grandma Gatewood, and becoming the third woman to hike the Appalachian Trail. Everybody thinks Emma Gatewood is the first woman to hike the Appalachian Trail. I'm here to tell you she was the third. She was the first to hike it by herself. So she gets credit for that. Anybody know who the first female thru hiker was? That would be Mildred Norman. Mildred Norman hiked in 1952 along the old section that we're talking about tonight with her boyfriend, Richard Lamb. 1952, a married couple in the woods, a little scandalous, and so they had a system. When they ran into people, her boyfriend, Richard Lamb, would go up to people and say, hi, I'm Dick Lamb, and this is Millie. and just leave it at that. Let everyone assume that they were married. In fact, the Galax Gazette described them as Mr. and Mrs. Hiker. And she hiked with Richard and they are Dick Lamb, and so she became the first woman to through hike the Appalachian Trail. But the first woman to hike every step of the trail was named Mary Kilpatrick. And she did it as a section hiker over 8 years in the 1930s. She was a chemistry professor in Philadelphia and did it with her husband and her husband's best friend. And so Mary Kilpatrick first, Mildred Norman, who, by the way, changed her name to Peace Pilgrim after she finished her hike, gave away all her possessions and walked North America over 28,000 miles advocating for nuclear disarmament. 28,000 miles with only a sweatsuit and like a tracksuit and a little fanny pack kind of thing that she had made, and that was it. And she was like a Buddhist monk. She lived on whatever people gave her. And so really a very interesting person. You can, if you're curious, there are YouTube videos of her speaking on college campuses. She had her own kind of philosophy. But so this National Geographic story connects to Grandma Gatewood, which takes us back to the Barnards, which takes us back to the Pinnacles of Dan. The third story I'll tell you is about the Dixon family. So this is Dixon's Ferry Bridge, just north of Fries. And this is how you get across the New River at Fries these days. This bridge was built in the late 50s, and but before that, you got across the river on Dixon's Ferry. It's not much of a ferry. That's Redbird is the name of their boat, and that's Charlie Dixon in the background and his father, whose name I can't remember, in the foreground. They were the last operators of the ferry before the bridge was built that was then named for their family. The Dixons, like many families in Southwest Virginia, the Dixons, settler families in Southwest Virginia, they got their land as a result of a Revolutionary War land grant, and so their ancestor had fought in the Revolutionary War, and they got land on the river, and they established this ferry. So the way you got across the river in the old days of the trail was if you're going south, you went to the Dixon family, knocked on their door, and Mr. and Mrs. Dixon would put you in Redbird, hopefully with a little less water in it, and they would pull you across for a nickel. And if you were coming north, you had to stand on the far side of the river and shout until somebody at the house heard you. And if you've been to the New River there, you know, it's kind of wide. And so I asked Gene Espy about that. I said, so Gene, you know, when you were hiking north and you got to the river, how long did you have to stand on the far shore and shout? He thought about it and he said, I don't know, but it was a long time. and so and I said, what else do you remember? And he said that he remembered there was a little girl. And he said, I don't know, she was really young. And she was inside the screen door. And he said, I was trying to get her to come out and talk to me because he was sitting on the porch having a glass of water with Mrs. Dixon. It was Mrs. Dixon who took him across. And he said, she just wouldn't come out. Well, that little girl's name was Sally. And she's now Sally Dixon Riggs. And I interviewed her for the book. And I said to Sally, do you remember this hiker from Georgia? And she said, oh yeah, Mr. Espy, I remember him. And she said, he sent us a postcard when he got to Maine and he finished his hike. He was really nice. And I said, well, he said you wouldn't come out from behind the screen door. And she said, well, no, you know, he had a beard. and I said, why was that a problem? Because if you've been to Damascus yesterday, 3/4 of the male hikers who were there had beards. So, you know, it's just kind of a thing. And I said, why was that a problem? And she said, well, my daddy always told me that I should stay away from men with beards because they were either hobos or communists. So she was afraid that Gene was one of those two things. You know? So I told Gene that later, and he said, well, I guess I did kind of look like a hobo. So this is, you know, this whole trail is just full of stories. This is just 3 of the ones that I tell in the book. But it's just full of these kinds of stories of people's memories. And I just want to kind of give you a sense of why it all comes together. I'm just going to read you the last couple of paragraphs from the book. Because I think it, you know, as interesting as it is about the kind of machinations. And I should say the reason they moved the trail in 1952, after the 1952 season, is that the Jefferson National Forest had expanded dramatically, and so they could move the trail from places like Floyd and Patrick County, they could move it over to the west and put it on federal land. And so it would be protected, and the Forest Service would help take care of it. And so it's just a practical choice. And they couldn't ever get a trail club to stick in those counties. And so they would have to send volunteers down from Washington and from Roanoke to work on the trail. So, so this is just the very end of the book here. So the Appalachian Trail left its original route in southwestern Virginia at the end of the 1952 hiking season and quickly passed out of the knowledge of the vast majority of the Appalachian Trail community. Because it was written out of the trail guides, hikers passing north and south in ever-growing numbers had no way to learn what they were missing, that they were missing out on the pinnacles of Dan, the climb up Farmer Mountain and its 360-degree views, or the opportunity to see the second highest waterfall in Virginia up on Bent Mountain. But the trail left many traces on the landscape of this region, some of which are still easily read today. The Galax chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution is the Appalachian Trail chapter, although the current DAR leaders weren't quite sure why when I asked them. And one of them said, "Do you know?" I said, "Yeah, I do." Several roads still bear the name Appalachian Trail. I drove on one yesterday, in fact. It was called Old Appalachian Trail Road. And if you know where to look, you can find rusty old Appalachian Trail markers on trees, likely put there by Shirley Cole and Myron Avery back in 1931. Those are the tangible things. The intangible things are just as important. So think about this for just a minute. All of us have a place where we feel the most connected, the most comfortable, the place where we know the way things smell, how the wind blows, how people talk, and what everyone is eating. Even in this seemingly rootless world, where jet planes shuttle millions through the air every day, where people move with increasing frequency in search of jobs, water, of security, to get away from war, fire, or famine, most human beings are still rooted in their places, the places they've named, the places they know best. And in the South, that place isn't just a place, it's a home place. And home places are endowed with even greater significance than ordinary locations. Every home place, wherever it is, has its own stories. And these are some of the stories people told me when I was doing these interviews. You know, over there, that's where lightning hit that big tree. Right here, that's where we first met. Up there on the mountain, that's where those folks were lost for 3 days. And my personal favorite, you can see it down there where the river bends. That's where our neighbor's son found that dead bear. Places become a code, a shorthand for stories that define who we are, who we've been, and who we will be. Physical geography, buildings, soundscapes, smells, they provide the boundaries, the parameters for memory, for understanding, for teaching, and most of all, for belonging. But just as important as those physical things, if not more so, are the stories. The stories the Dixon family members tell about poling hikers across the river in Redford. Ralph Barnard's tales of hikers and their fear of panthers. They used to tell him all the time they were terrified of panthers. The hope that Richard Farmer, the mayor of Freeze, still holds out for the town. Dorothy Shiflett, who is the daughter of Shirley Cole, Dorothy Shiflett's stories of building trail with her father, and the pride in Doug Bell's voice when he speaks of how the Appalachian Trail came to his grandfather's front door. In a part of America where the past really matters, the Appalachian Trail lives on, inscribed on the inner landscapes of the people who still remember and are determined not to forget. In this Appalachian heartland, where people's lives are organized around stories of the past, and how that past is inextricably woven into their present and their future, memories of the Appalachian Trail and their place in its history remain an important way that they make sense of their world. They wish other people remembered it the way they do, but in the end, all that really matters is that they remember the old trail. So, thanks. What questions would you like me to answer? Yes.
You remember when the old Mons Hotel burned down?
I'm too young for that, sorry. No, I said I'm too young. No, I just know that it did.
Well, my granddad had it rebuilt. And my uncle had a collage of old photographs of the new hotel. So if you go up there, ask the clerk as you go in to see that collage, because it's really something.
That'd be neat.
It's
that'd be
neat, really
Yeah,
neat.
thank you, thank you. Yeah, like a lot of the photographs that I showed came out of shoeboxes in people's closets, not out of some archive somewhere. I think in the book, like there's one photo from the Bent Mountain collection at the Roanoke Public Library and a few photos from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy archives, but most of those photos are either photos that people shared with me from their shoeboxes or their scrapbooks or pictures I took myself. Other questions? Yes?
Who said Panther? Reason for asking, yeah.
Yeah, so it was Ralph Barnard. He said, you know, he talked about panthers in the Dan River Gorge, and you know, we would say mountain lions
Well,
today.
yeah.
Yeah.
My grandfather wrote some family history. His great-grandfather talked about the panther that was stalking the old home place, and that was Stone Mountain, North Carolina.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And obviously, panther is probably the German, you know, so, you know, we say mountain lion or cougar, right? But if they were Germans, you know, that came to Philadelphia down to Carolina Road, settled in West North Carolina,
It would make sense.
they would
yeah.
say the German word,
Yeah.
panther.
Yeah. And if you've ever heard a mountain lion scream, it's kind of otherworldly sound, and Ralph said that, you know, the hikers from Washington would come down and they get down in the gorge and they would hear one of those mountain lions scream, and he said they would come running back up to the farm. What was that? What else? Yes?
What was the name of the shelter that you were showing? the
It's
photo?
unnamed.
It's an unnamed
It's
one.
an unnamed shelter, yeah. I think it should be the Earl Schaefer shelter, because he's the only person who ever wrote about spending the night there. But, yes?
Oh, I was gonna say, is it a shelter you can camp in?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know if the Blue Ridge Parkway technically allows you to camp in their territory or not.
We were up on the, at Shenandoah at Hawksbill Mountain, and there's a Harry Bird shelter there, no camping.
Yeah, the bird shelters in Shenandoah are not open. There are 4 of them, and they're not open for camping. But I will say, if you decide to camp up there, there's no water, so you have to bring your water. And no printer, just saying. Yes?
Interesting about the CCC and all the work that they did. Do you remember the old radar station that was up there right off of the,
No.
yeah.
Where was it?
Well, it would have been, do you know where the road comes out onto the parkway
Mm-hmm.
from Overstreet Creek?
Okay, yeah.
Well, the radar station was right to the right of that.
Hmm. I'm surprised they didn't put it up on Buffalo Mountain. It would have been a better spot, right?
But anyway,
What else?
How did you get started connecting with these people once you decided to hit the human element? Did you just start with one and keep asking, do you know?
Who else should I talk to? Yeah, so when I first got started, I connected with Kathleen Inglesby, who used to be on the board of this organization. She lives in Floyd, and she was I stayed with them last night, and she was really excited because she knew Mr. Kegley pretty well, and just had nothing but wonderful things to say about him at dinner last night. And she used to direct the Old Church Gallery in Floyd, which is it's really a museum, not a gallery, and they have some really wonderful stuff in there, especially their quilt collection is fabulous. But and so she was one of the first people I connected with, and then I gave a talk at the Floyd Public Library, which is how I met Doug Bell, and then through Kathleen is how I met Ralph, and then the Dixon family I met through the New River Genealogy Forum, and I just posted a note there saying I'm working on this. I was actually trying to find the forest guard for the eastern portion of the Unaka National Forest, so I posted there, and Paula Dixon Rakes wrote and said, well, I don't know anything about that guy, but you know, my family used to run the ferry across the river. So I went to, and I've gotten close also with the Rakes family and the Dixon family, and so in 2020, this was 2021, I went to the family reunion, the Dixon family reunion down on the river. They still have one little piece of land on the river, and where they go camping and fishing and have the family reunion. And I met Sally's brother, Greg Dixon, who also remembered a bunch of the hikers. And one of the gentlemen there came up to me and he said, "Tell me you're a college professor." I said, "That's right, I am." And he said, "You must be a liberal." I said, "That's right, I am." And he said, "Can we talk? I don't meet many liberals." And so we sat down and we just had the most delightful conversation, not about politics. He didn't want to talk about politics. He wanted to talk about the old Appalachian Trail and about the Dixon family and all that. And you know, it's a reminder, those kinds of conversations are a reminder that we're not the people, we are not the people depicted on the nightly news. That, like, real people talk to each other. And they sit down, even if they're divided politically, they sit down and they have a hot dog, or I think we had barbecue, you know, together, and they just talk. And you know, it's especially if you live in the Washington, D.C. area, it's really good to be reminded of that, because you're just like the news, it just permeates every cell in your body. But so yeah, so it was really fun. We chatted for probably an hour. Yes, ma'am.
In your research, did you ever run across, there was a lady who hiked the trail and had tennis shoes?
That was Grandma Gateway.
Okay, I thought that might be
Yeah,
that.
Converse high tops,
Yeah.
existing primarily on Vienna sausages.
Yeah, and it's also her.
She loved her Vienna sausages, but she was also a little shameless about begging. Because if she was hungry and she didn't have any food, if there was a house, she would just go up and knock on the door and say, "I'm hungry, can you give me some food?" And they see this little old lady with, and she didn't even have a backpack, she had a sling that she'd made out of an old denim skirt, and they, you know, she was essentially an unhoused person, a homeless person, and they would see this little old lady. I mean, if she'd been, you know, male and 22, they would have said, "Move along, son." But you know, how can you turn grandma away? And then she would get a free meal, and they'd let her sleep in the bed, you know, and then she would move on up the trail. So she was pretty good at getting what she wanted. So I'll also say that Grandma Gatewood never met a microphone she didn't like. She was a very good self-promoter, very good self-promoter.
Did you bring copies of your book?
I did. I brought copies of my book if you would like to purchase and sign it for you. I'm happy to do that also. Any other questions before we get to that part? Yes?
In your book, you write about somebody that brought mail to open
Oh, yeah.
their cans, and then you've got the Grandma Gatewood stories. They seem like different hikers. What was that, just like the culture at the time? You didn't really prepare?
Not so much. First of all, there were no backpacking stores. You could buy backpacking gear from LL Bean or Abercrombie and Fitch. It's hard to imagine that the mall store Abercrombie and Fitch was the world's premier outfitter. And in the 70s, they became a mall clothing store. They ditched the whole outfitter stuff. But so you could buy stuff, mail order that way. Or military surplus, which is how most people got their gear in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. In fact, my first times on the Appalachian Trail were in Shenandoah National Park, and my scoutmaster in Falls Church, Virginia, Mr. Ballard, was he was a World War II vet. He fought his way across the Pacific. He was in charge of one of the Navajo code talker squads. It was really fascinating to listen to him. He could speak Navajo, and he learned it from his soldiers, and he was a sergeant. And he was from California, and he didn't know anything about the Appalachian Trail. He just knew that Shenandoah National Park was close, and there was a trail in the park that was called the Appalachian Trail, and that's the trail we hiked on. And in 1973, a man named Ed Garvey came and spoke to our Boy Scout troop. He lived in the neighborhood, and he had just published a book about his thru hike from 2 years earlier. And it was the first book published about a thru hike. It wasn't the first thru hike, it was his first book published about it. And he showed slides from his hike. And I was 12, 13, and I just remember thinking, wait, that trail we hike on, it goes all the way to Georgia? All the way to Maine? Really? And I couldn't believe it. And, but so, yeah, the guy with the nail, that was Chester Jingalewski. He was the first person to hike the trail from Maine to Georgia instead of Georgia to Maine. He was a machinist from Naugatuck, Connecticut, and he was rough, He had some old chino pants, like military surplus chinos that he'd cut the legs off of, so they were shorts, and he he was, you know, sort of the ultimate ultralight hiker. He carried virtually nothing, and you know, he would just sleep in the woods. And his can opener was a nail and a rock, and he would just go into little stores and buy some canned food, and then, you know, pound it open with a nail and a rock, and then put it in the fire until it was hot, and that was dinner. And so they were just different. In fact, in Damascus, so for trail days, they do a big parade, and they do it by class, by the year that you completed your hike. Whether you did it all in 1 year or just you finished in that particular year. And the class of 1998 had signs that said, you know, class of 1998, and then another sign that said, no cell phone, no YouTube, no apps, no, you know, it's all the things that they didn't have. And then it said at the bottom, when hiking the Appalachian Trail was actually hard.
In my newspaper research of early Roanoke Times articles, I find that there was a Roanoke hiking club in the teens. Obviously precedes any Appalachian Trail Club, but it's very fascinating. In this area, there's always been an interest in organized hikes
Sure.
To the surrounding mountainsides and everything. So I don't know who anything about the trails that they carved out or anything like that.
Yeah, and Diana Christopoulos, who is the past president of the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club and the current archivist, she is really the expert on that. And the archive, she's gotten the club's archives all organized, and I think they're going to Virginia Tech or Roanoke College, I can't remember which. And so, but yeah, she has some stuff about those early hikers.
Maybe we'll connect with her. I've got one last question, unless there's a burning question. We'll wrap up here, and you can always ask questions as you buy his book immediately after this. But it's my understanding that most trail hikers have a trail name.
Trail name.
What's your name?
My trail name is Granddaddy Spartan.
There you go.
Which is an indication that you don't get to pick your trail name. So people choose it for you, and you live with it for the rest of your life. And so mine is Granddaddy Spartan, and the story behind that, because I'm sure you're wondering, is I've been hiking with my older son for about a week and a half, and this was years ago. There was an animated film called 300 about the Spartan, you know, Sparta, and so it had just come out that year. And so it's popular, and when I don't shave, my beard comes in pure white. This has been going on since I was in my 20s, and I've been hiking with my older son, who's 6'5", and so his stride is much greater than mine, and he was, you know, a lot younger, and so keeping up with him, I was really tired. And we get to a trail shelter. I've got the white beard. I'm exhausted, and I'm just kind of leaning against the wall of the trail shelter, waiting for what's known as hiker midnight, which is when you get to go to bed, and it's whenever you decide. That's hiker midnight. But you know, it was too early to go to bed, but I really wanted to, and I was just like kind of zonked against the side of the shelter. And one of the thru hikers who was there chatting with my son, he looked at me and said, "Dude, you look just like Granddaddy Spartan." And my son said, "Well, he did need a trail name," and all the thru hikers said, "Yes, a trail name." That's how it happened. And so yeah, there's some good trail names out there, I'll tell you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you,
so
Dr. Mills, for
if you would like to purchase the book, it's you can buy it. It's $23.99. However, for you, cash discount $20 makes it easy. I also